morning fog clings to the Rhine like a gray shroud. Cold mist rises from the water as thunder echoes from distant artillery. The river, wide, fast, and ancient, divides the ruined German countryside from the advancing American lines. To the Allies, it is the last great barrier before the heart of Hitler's empire. To the Germans, it is the final wall of defense. Through the haze, scouts of the 9th Armored Division spot something impossible. A steel colossus stretches across the Rhine, the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. Smoke curls from shattered girders, but the span remains intact. It should have been gone, blown apart like every other bridge from Cologne to Koblenz. Yet there it is, battered, trembling, but whole. Radio calls erupt. Engineers rush forward. Officers stare through binoculars in disbelief. The order spreads like electricity. The bridge is still there, take it. As the first American shells whistle overhead, soldiers realize they are staring at a moment no one thought possible. The race to cross the Rhine, bond and end the war, begins not with a grand plan but with a chance discovery in the fog of Remagen. The wall before Berlin. By early 1945, the German war machine was collapsing, but it was not yet broken. The Battle of the Bulge had failed, and Hitler's last great gamble in the Ardennes was reduced to a trail of burning tanks and frozen corpses. The Allies had clawed their way out of the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, pushing eastward once more. But every mile came at a cost measured in blood and steel. For the Allied soldiers trudging through the wreckage of Europe, the name whispered ahead like both a goal and a warning. The Rhine. It was more than just a river. It was a symbol of Germany itself, the legendary boundary that had protected the fatherland for centuries. From Roman legions to Napoleonic armies, the Rhine had always stood as a dividing line between invaders and the heart of German power. By February 1945, the Allied High Command, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and Bernard Montgomery, knew that crossing this natural fortress would decide the fate of the war in Europe. Beyond the Rhine lay the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, its furnaces, its coal, its war factories. Capture that, and the Reich would be finished. But the Rhine was no ordinary obstacle. At some points it stretched over 1,000 feet wide, its currents fast and treacherous, flanked by cliffs and towns now turned to rubble. Every bridge had been wired for destruction, every crossing point watched by German guns. In the first weeks of 1945, the Allied advance became a race against time and German desperation. Hitler, retreating into delusion inside his Berlin bunker, ordered that no bridge over the Rhine should fall intact. If necessary, they were to be destroyed even if German troops were still crossing. To him, the river was destiny's line, a sacred border that must never be violated by the enemy. On the ground, the weather turned the battlefield into a nightmare. Snow melted into mud, trucks bogged down, artillery guns sank into the soft earth, and fuel convoys stretched for miles across the ruined roads of the Ardennes. Yet the Allied machine kept rolling. Cities like Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz were hammered by constant bombing raids. Entire divisions of the Wehrmacht disintegrated under the pressure. Still, German resistance remained fierce. In the small towns along the western bank, Andernach, Neuwied, Remagen, pockets of veterans, Volkssturm militias, and Hitler youth set up desperate defenses. They fought not for victory, but for time. Time for the rest of Germany to regroup behind the Rhine. To the west, Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared a massive, deliberate crossing in the north. In the center, Bradley's 12th Army Group advanced more rapidly, probing for weaknesses, and on the southern flank, Patton's 3rd Army thundered toward the river with his usual impatience. Behind the front lines, Allied engineers worked relentlessly. They built pontoon ferries, laid Bailey bridges across canals, and repaired shattered roads, preparing for a crossing that, everyone believed, would take weeks of planning. Every bridge over the Rhine was assumed destroyed. Every engineer knew the river would have to be crossed the hard way, under fire from scratch. The Rhine, in the eyes of the Allied command, was not just a challenge of courage, it was a mathematical problem. How to move armies of hundreds of thousands, along with tanks, trucks, fuel, food, and ammunition, across a river deeper and wider than any they had yet faced. As the first days of March arrived, reconnaissance photos confirmed the grim news. From the Netherlands to southern Germany, every major crossing had been demolished. Twisted metal and collapsed spans marked the edge of the river like scars. And yet, something unexpected was about to happen. For all their preparations, for all their calculations, the Allies would not conquer the Rhine with a massive plan or months of engineering. Instead, fate, and one division's relentless advance, would lead them to a narrow town, a standing bridge, and a chance that would change the war overnight. The road to Remagen. By the first week of March 1945, the Allied front stretched like a steel blade from the North Sea to the Saar. Every day, columns of tanks rolled through the smoldering remains of German villages. The Luftwaffe was nearly gone, its pilots outnumbered and outgunned, but the German army, though bleeding and fractured, still fought with the tenacity of the cornered. For the U.S. First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges, the advance was both swift and dangerous. Hodges' men were exhausted from months of combat, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of Hurtgen and the snowbound hell of the Bulge. Yet their momentum was unstoppable. Among his spearhead units was the 9th Armored Division, under Major General John W. Leonard. It was a division that had earned a reputation for speed and precision, a mixture of veterans and young soldiers who had learned to improvise in chaos. Their orders in early March were simple in theory: push east, seize crossings over the Rhine River, and link up with other forces preparing to reach the Rhine. No one expected to find a bridge still standing. The German High Command, following Hitler's strict directive, had already begun demolishing every crossing along the Rhine. In the north, at Wesel and Düsseldorf, entire spans were blown into the water under the glare of Allied bombers. In the south, near Mannheim and Karlsruhe, the demolitions created massive fireballs visible for miles. The river became a ribbon of broken metal, but Remagen, a modest riverside town with medieval streets and a Gothic church spire, held one final bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge. Originally built in 1916, it was a steel truss railway bridge nearly 200 feet long, connecting Remagen to the eastern bank village of Erpel. It had twin towers of dark stone at each end, solid, fortress-like, built to withstand artillery. It had survived decades of floods and storms, and now it stood as the last intact link over the Rhine. The German officer responsible for its defense, Captain Willy Brandt, commanded a small, battered force, engineers, anti-aircraft gunners, and a few scattered infantry. He had received orders to rig the bridge for destruction, but to keep it open until the last German troops crossed. That balance, to defend and yet prepare to destroy, would prove fatal. Meanwhile, the 9th Armored Division pushed toward the town almost by accident. Their initial orders were to secure the high ground near Remagen and wait for further instruction. But reconnaissance reports showed something unusual. No significant German armor, no major defensive line, and more importantly, a bridge still visible across the Rhine. On the morning of March 7th, scouts from the division's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion reported seeing the silhouette of the Ludendorff Bridge still standing through the smoke. At first the news seemed impossible, perhaps a misidentification or maybe a trick of light through the haze. But when Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, a 24-year-old officer leading a vanguard unit, raised his binoculars, the truth stunned him. The bridge was real. It was damaged, partially obscured by smoke but unmistakably intact. Timmerman radioed his superior. "The bridge is there. Repeat, the bridge is still standing." Across the chain of command, disbelief turned into urgency. General Leonard immediately contacted General Hodges, who then reached Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters. The message relayed upward read like a miracle: an intact bridge across the Rhine. Bradley, cautious by nature, hesitated. Could it be a trap? Eisenhower, informed within the hour, was skeptical but intrigued. He had been preparing massive coordinated crossings involving hundreds of thousands of men, supported by engineers, boats, and air cover. Now a small division stood at the threshold of Germany's heart with a single opportunity: a chance to seize a bridge before it vanished in flames. The decision would rest not on generals far behind the lines, but on the men standing before that trembling steel structure at Remagen. The Rhine was supposed to be impregnable, and yet for the first time in modern warfare its myth was about to be shattered, not by planning but by instinct. In the spring of 1945, the Rhine was not just a river, and it was a fortress. Both sides understood that whoever controlled its crossings would control the tempo of the war's final act. For the Allies, the Rhine represented a logistical nightmare. It was the only natural defense left for the crumbling Reich, and crossing it under fire would require more than courage. It demanded coordination, deception, and speed. General Eisenhower's original plan was methodical. The northern crossing near Wesel would be Montgomery's grand offensive, supported by hundreds of bombers and thousands of artillery pieces. In the south, Patton's Third Army was to force a crossing near Mainz. Each operation involved weeks of engineering preparation, reconnaissance flights, and stockpiles of pontoon equipment. But what happened at Remagen was not planned. It was a spontaneous act that reshaped the timetable of the entire Allied campaign. When the 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge intact, the war's geography suddenly changed. A full-scale crossing in the north would no longer define victory. It could begin here, in a small riverside town with one trembling span of steel. For the Germans, the situation was catastrophic. The Rhine had been the final red line of their defense doctrine, the boundary that would give them time to regroup. The Wehrmacht had built countless defensive positions along its banks, but without bridges, those defenses meant little. Once the Americans gained a foothold on the eastern side, the Germans could no longer maneuver effectively. The tactical brilliance of Remagen lay not in brute force but in initiative. The officers on the ground, Leonard, Timmerman, and their engineers, recognized that opportunity rarely knocks twice in war. They seized it before higher command could overthink it. Their speed broke the rhythm of the German defense and opened a corridor that the enemy could not close. Behind every battlefield victory lay the quiet genius of the engineers. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had already earned a reputation for miracles, constructing floating bridges under fire in Normandy, rebuilding supply routes in record time, and keeping entire armies moving across Europe's shattered infrastructure. But the challenge of the Rhine was on a scale unseen in modern warfare. Before Remagen, Allied engineers expected weeks of preparation to assemble floating pontoon systems. Each Bailey Bridge could take days, even under ideal conditions. The currents of the Rhine, running at 7 to 8 miles per hour, could sweep away entire pontoon sections. The water was deep, cold, and filled with debris from the bombed ruins upstream. At Remagen, everything had to happen in real time, under shell fire, without blueprints, and with enemy demolition charges still ticking inside the bridge. The Ludendorff Bridge was already damaged. Portions of the decking had collapsed. Railings were torn apart by artillery. German engineers had planted over 600 pounds of explosives in the bridge's structure. But when the detonations failed to destroy it, the Americans had only hours to secure it before another attempt was made. The first U.S. engineers to reach the bridge, men of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, worked in teams, cutting wires, defusing charges, and shoring up the damaged supports even as snipers fired from the cliffs above. Their work was surgical and frantic. Every bolt they turned, every wire they cut was done in the dark roar of battle. By the end of that first day, the engineers had performed what would later be described as a mechanical miracle. Within 10 hours, they had not only secured the bridge, but also established a steady flow of infantry and vehicles across the Rhine. By dawn, reinforcements and armored units were pouring over, turning a lucky discovery into a full-scale offensive. The Ludendorff crossing became a masterclass in combat engineering, an example taught for decades afterward in military academies worldwide. It proved that adaptability could defeat even the most rigid of plans. For the German defenders, the sight of American tanks rolling across the Rhine was beyond comprehension. Reports from the 15th Army, which guarded the central sector, described confusion, disbelief, and raw panic. Messages arriving at Army Group B headquarters, under Field Marshal Walter Model, were contradictory. One claimed the bridge had been destroyed. Another, minutes later, said enemy armor was crossing it. Model, a skilled defensive strategist but now commanding ghost divisions of exhausted men, reportedly slammed his fist on the table when he heard the news. Impossible. The bridge was blown. The Germans had depended entirely on their assumption that no intact bridge remained. Their fallback plan involved using ferries and temporary spans further upstream. When the Ludendorff remained standing, that logic collapsed. Units on both sides of the river were trapped in disarray, some retreating too early, others still on the western bank when the Americans advanced. Hitler's reaction was immediate and furious. He saw the loss of the bridge as an act of betrayal. Orders were sent down for investigations, arrests, and summary executions. The officers responsible for Remagen's defenses, including Captain Bridge and his superiors, were court-martialed, some later shot for cowardice. For ordinary German soldiers, the event was surreal. For years they had been told that the Rhine was impregnable, that no foreign army would ever cross it alive. And now, within hours, American engineers and tanks stood on the far shore, their flags visible against the smoke. The myth of the Rhine, and with it the illusion of the Reich's invincibility, had been shattered. From every perspective, tactical, technical, or psychological, Remagen was a turning point disguised as a coincidence. Yet beyond the maps and machinery lay the most profound dimension of all, the human one. The fear, the exhaustion, and the courage of the men who crossed a bridge they weren't sure would hold another minute, and that's where we turn next. For the men of the 9th Armored Division, the approach to the Ludendorff Bridge felt like stepping into a nightmare. The air was thick with cordite and dust. German artillery shells shrieked overhead, bursting among the ruins of Remagen. Buildings collapsed in flames. Debris rained down on soldiers crouched in the mud. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, barely 24 years old, led the assault. He had grown up the son of a German immigrant in Nebraska. A curious twist of fate that placed him now, rifle in hand, charging toward his ancestral homeland's final line of defense. As his men advanced through the shattered streets, snipers fired from church towers and rooftops. Every sound, the crack of a rifle, the metallic groan of the bridge ahead, carried the same unspoken question. Would it explode beneath them? Yet they kept moving. Squads sprinted toward the western bridge towers, firing at silhouettes in the windows. Engineers followed close behind, carrying wire cutters, pliers, and demolition tools instead of rifles. One sergeant later recalled, "We didn't know if the bridge was wired to blow, but there wasn't time to think. We just ran." As the first Americans set foot on the span, German defenders triggered remaining charges. Flashes erupted, chunks of steel flew into the air, and sections of the decking collapsed. But the main structure held. The explosions had failed to finish the job. That moment, the thunder of failed demolition, the bridge still standing, marked a shift in morale that no general's order could replicate. Soldiers who had expected death suddenly saw a chance at survival. Men who had been fighting for months without rest found themselves part of something historic. One by one, under relentless fire, they crossed the bridge. Infantry first, then tanks of Company A, 14th Tank Battalion. The first Sherman to make it across, nicknamed Sherman Fireball, rumbled onto the eastern bank as engineers shouted and waved. They had done it. For the first time in the war, an Allied army stood on the east side of the Rhine. Back at headquarters, as reports came in, General Hodges faced the kind of decision that defines military leadership. Act instantly or risk losing everything. The bridge could collapse at any moment. It could be rigged with secondary explosives. It could even be a trap. Yet if they hesitated, the Germans might destroy it completely. Hodges gave the order without hesitation. Take it, hold it, and get everything across that bridge you can. The communication chain moved fast. General Leonard, commanding the 9th Armored, sent word to reinforce the crossing. Eisenhower and Bradley, upon hearing the news hours later, didn't believe it at first. Eisenhower reportedly paused for a long moment, then simply said, "Well, I'll be damned. Get them all over." What followed was a rare moment in modern warfare, the combination of daring initiative and unified command. No bureaucracy, no delay. Within hours, divisions were redirected, engineers mobilized, and support units converged on Remagen. Eisenhower understood what had just happened. A single division had opened a door that could shorten the war by weeks, maybe months. It was an opportunity too great to ignore, and he ordered it exploited at all costs. But leadership also meant accepting consequences. The bridge was unstable. Every crossing risked collapse. Soldiers, trucks, and tanks moved across in single file, the span vibrating under their weight. Engineers worked around the clock to shore up its supports. Several men fell into the icy Rhine, swept away by the current, never to be seen again. Commanders at every level, from Timmerman on the bridge to Eisenhower in his field HQ, carried that weight. The knowledge that victory might depend on a single structure holding together just a little longer. Beyond tactics and courage lay something deeper, the collapse of a myth. For centuries, the Rhine had symbolized German identity, pride, and invincibility. Its crossing had inspired poets, painters, and nationalists. It was sung in patriotic hymns as the sacred river that guarded the fatherland. In March 1945, that illusion drowned beneath the rumble of American tanks. News of the Remagen crossing spread through Allied and Axis lines alike. Soldiers who had fought through France and Belgium suddenly realized the end was near. German civilians, hearing rumors of Americans east of the Rhine, fled in panic. Even within Germany, the psychological blow was immense. The Rhine had been the Reich's natural moat, the guarantee that no foreign army would ever reach Berlin. And now it had been breached not through overwhelming force but through sheer chance and determination. For the Americans, it became more than a tactical success. It was a symbol of momentum, of unstoppable progress toward victory. Newspapers back home ran headlines calling it the miracle of Remagen. Photographs of soldiers crossing the bridge under smoke and fire spread across the world. To historians later, the event would come to represent the turning point between strategy and inevitability. The moment when Germany's war ceased to be about defense and became about survival. The symbolism of the Rhine's breach echoed far beyond the battlefield. It marked the triumph of ingenuity over arrogance, of flexibility over fanaticism. A single bridge, half broken, shrouded in smoke, had undone years of German propaganda about an invincible homeland. As night fell on March 7, 1945, exhausted American soldiers huddled on the eastern bank. The bridge groaned behind them, engineers still racing to keep it alive. Across the river, German artillery pounded relentlessly, trying to erase the humiliation. But the foothold was secure, and with that foothold came a realization that rippled through every level of command. The war in Europe had entered its final phase. March 8, 1945, the Rhine is burning. The air over Remagen trembles with the thunder of artillery. The Ludendorff Bridge, blackened, shaking, its girders twisted by the blasts of the day before, now carries an endless stream of men and machines eastward. Every few seconds, explosions ripple along the banks. German shells from the hills above Erpel rain down, splashing into the river or tearing holes through the bridge's steel trusses. And still they cross. Infantrymen crouch low, sprinting between gaps in the railings. Engineers wave them through, shouting over the roar of tanks grinding across the planks. Trucks creak, cables groan, and the bridge shivers with every ton of metal that passes over it. Beneath them, the current swirls thick and brown, cold enough to kill in minutes. For the Germans on the far bank, it is chaos. They had expected the bridge to be gone, to have exploded the day before. But when the Americans seized it, they had no plan left. Orders clashed. Communication lines broke down. Units scrambled to find ammunition, to position artillery, to organize counterattacks that would never come in time. From his command post, Field Marshal Walter Model raged at reports that grew worse by the hour. American tanks, were already east of the Rhine. His defenses, meant to hold for weeks, were collapsing overnight. He threw together fragments of divisions, paratroopers, engineers, flak crews, and ordered them toward Remagen. His words were desperate: destroy the bridge at all costs. By nightfall, the first German counterfire began. Flak batteries positioned near Linz opened up, sending tracer shells streaking across the river. Mortars thumped from the hills, and the once peaceful Rhine Valley erupted into a frenzy of explosions. The bridge seemed to sway with each impact like a living thing under assault. Below, American engineers of the 276th and 291st Battalions worked with grim focus. They patched holes in the decking, reinforced beams with timbers scavenged from nearby wreckage, and dragged sandbags to protect the bridge's foundations. Some worked barehanded, their gloves burned away from hot metal. They knew that every minute the bridge survived meant another platoon, another tank, another lifeline across the Rhine. One young engineer, Corporal William McMahon, later recalled, "It wasn't about orders anymore. You looked up, saw the bridge holding, and you just kept it alive. You didn't think about dying. You thought about the next bolt, the next beam." Above them, the sky turned orange as tracer fire arced overhead. The town of Remagen burned behind them, a smoldering ruin of brick and dust. Civilians hid in cellars, soldiers huddled in trenches. Every noise, every creak in the bridge's structure felt like the start of collapse. On the eastern side, the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion established a bridgehead, fanning out across the hills around Erpel. They dug foxholes in frozen ground, fending off small counterattacks from disorganized German units. Each hill taken expanded the fragile American foothold, a patch of land that would soon grow into an unstoppable front. German command tried everything. They launched V-2 rockets from the Netherlands aiming at the bridge, the first time those weapons had ever been used against a tactical target. The massive missiles roared across the sky, but none struck the bridge directly. They exploded in nearby fields and towns, terrifying but ineffective. Next came the Luftwaffe, its dying strength thrown into one last effort. On March 9th, a small group of Me-262 jet fighters streaked over Remagen, dropping bombs that splashed harmlessly into the river. Old Stuka dive bombers followed, their sirens wailing, but Allied anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with smoke and shrapnel. Of the dozens of aircraft sent, most never returned. The Germans even attempted to use frogmen, combat divers of the Kleinkampfverbände, to swim across the river with explosives strapped to their chests. The current was too strong. None reached the target. Every method failed. Every attempt to erase the bridge ended in futility. As days passed, the crossing widened. Engineers constructed pontoon ferries and began assembling a steel treadway bridge just downstream. The Ludendorff, battered and barely holding, had bought them the time they needed. By March 10th, more than 8,000 American troops and hundreds of vehicles had crossed into the east. The once timid foothold had grown into a formidable bridgehead nearly 5 miles deep. The Rhine, once thought uncrossable, now lay behind them. But victory came with a price. The bridge groaned under constant stress, its supports fractured by near misses and shock waves. Engineers feared it could collapse at any moment. Each tank crossing sent shudders through the steel. Men crossing on foot glanced up at the vibrating girders, whispering prayers as they ran, and yet it stood. Hour after hour, day after day, it endured what physics said it could not. Remagen had become the front line of the impossible, where ingenuity met desperation, and where the future of the war crossed from west to east. As the Americans strengthened their grip on the eastern bank, the German attacks grew more frenzied. Desperate acts from a dying army trying to undo a miracle. The coming nights would bring even greater fury, and a final test of whether the bridge and those who held it could survive the storm. 10 hours to eternity. March 11th, 1945. Dawn breaks pale over the Rhine. A low fog clings to the river, muffling the rumble of engines and the distant crack of artillery. The Ludendorff Bridge still stands, but barely. Its once proud steel frame is now a twisted skeleton, every joint trembling with fatigue. The timbers shudder beneath the endless traffic, trucks, tanks, ambulances, as the U.S. Army pours everything it has across this fragile thread of steel. Colonel Clayton Townsend, commander of the 1056th Engineer Group, watches from the riverbank. His orders are clear. Keep the bridge open or replace it if it dies. Behind him, convoys stretch for miles. The entire 1st U.S. Army under Courtney Hodges depends on this crossing. Without it, the eastern thrust and the race into Germany's heart would stop cold. And the Germans know it. At 10 a.m., another wave of attacks begins. Long-range 88-meter guns from the hills near Bruckhausen open fire. Their shells howl over the river, slamming into the approaches. Bridgesides collapse, trucks flip into the water, and smoke cloaks the valley. The 9th Armored Division fights to hold the line while engineers, helmets gleaming with sweat, race to keep the bridge alive. Then around noon, the Germans unleash a final horror. Arado R-234 jet bombers, the fastest in the world. They swoop low, engines screaming, and drop bombs that send geysers of water crashing skyward. The shock waves tear at the already weakened structure. One bomb strikes the far ramp, shearing off a chunk of roadway. The bridge groans and metal shrieking against metal. For a heartbeat, everyone freezes. Then the engineers surge forward again. Lieutenant Jack Hyde of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion shouts over the noise, "Don't stop! We've kept it 10 days, and we'll keep it 10 more if we have to." His men drag timbers, cables, anything they can find to brace the wounded bridge. Sparks fly from welding torches, water sprays from burst pipes. Above them, American anti-aircraft guns fire without pause, tracing bright arcs across the sky. But Townsend knows the truth. The Ludendorff can't last much longer. He gives a new order. Build another bridge. That same afternoon, engineers move 2 miles downstream. On the muddy western bank, they begin laying the first sections of a steel treadway bridge, the kind meant for light vehicles and infantry. Every component must be ferried by hand or raft, because the Germans still hold the eastern heights. Snipers fire from across the river. Mortar shells whistle overhead. And yet the work doesn't stop. By nightfall, generators hum under canvas tarps, casting pools of yellow light. Men hammer, weld, and lash pontoon sections into place. The air smells of oil, smoke, and the metallic tang of the river. A few engineers fall to sniper fire. Others take their places without a word. By 2 a.m., a skeleton of floating steel stretches halfway across the Rhine. The current tugs at it like a living force, testing every joint. The men work waist-deep in the freezing water, guiding pontoons into position with ropes. When a section slips, it threatens to drag them under. Still, they hold on. At 6 a.m. to March 12th, the sun rises on something no one thought possible. A new bridge taking shape beside the old. Townsend walks its length, his boots splashing through the shallows, and nods once. 10 hours of non-stop labor. 10 hours that will change the course of the war. Behind him, the Ludendorff still stands, battered but alive. American engineers have achieved the unthinkable. Not just one bridge across the Rhine, but two. In Berlin, news of Remagen spreads like wildfire. Hitler's fury is volcanic. He calls it a disgrace to the German army. Within days, he orders Field Marshal Model to convene a special court-martial for those responsible. 5 German officers, including Major Hans Scheller, who commanded the bridge's defense, are executed by firing squad. But punishment changes nothing. The Americans now have an open door into the heart of Germany. Within 48 hours, 30,000 troops, 1,000 vehicles, and dozens of tanks have crossed to the eastern bank. Pontoon ferries run around the clock. The 78th Infantry Division expands the bridgehead north toward Erpel and Unkel. The 9th Armored Division pushes east toward Linz. The Germans fight desperately but without coordination. Remagen, once a quiet riverside town, has become a symbol. The moment when the Allied armies truly invaded Germany itself. But the Ludendorff's defiance has limits. On March 17th, just after 3 p.m., engineers working beneath the bridge hear a deep groan. Rivets pop loose like gunfire. A ripple runs through the structure. Then with a deafening roar, the central span collapses into the Rhine. Dozens of soldiers and engineers are thrown into the river. 28 die instantly. Many more are injured. Those who survive claw their way to shore, coughing up silt and river water, watching the steel skeleton sink into the current. For a moment, silence falls over Remagen. Then slowly the sound of engines rises again. Tanks rolling across the new bridges the engineers had built in just 10 hours. The crossing continues, unstoppable. Even in death, the Ludendorff had fulfilled its purpose. It had stood long enough. That night, as fires smolder along the river banks and the roar of artillery echoes eastward, one exhausted engineer writes in his journal, "The bridge is gone. But we made it. We crossed the Rhine. The war's ending, and I can feel it." He was right. Within 2 months, Germany would surrender. But the crossing at Remagen would be remembered forever, as the moment when courage, speed, and ingenuity shattered the last barrier of Hitler's Reich. The Rhine had been breached. And now, the world's attention turned to what lay beyond, the heartland of a collapsing empire, and the price of victory yet to come. The shockwave that broke Germany's spirit. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally sank beneath the Rhine on March 17, 1945, the battle for its control was already won. The crossing at Remagen had outlived its builders' wildest hopes. For 10 days it carried the weight of an army and the burden of history. Now, as its wreckage settled into the brown waters below, its legacy was already reshaping the war. To the west, the Allied High Command moved with new urgency. The impossible had happened. The Rhine, Germany's great natural fortress, had been crossed. General Omar Bradley sent out a terse message to headquarters. "We've got a bridge and we're across." It was the sentence every soldier on the Western Front had waited to hear. The effect rippled outward like an electric shock. At Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters, staff officers gathered around maps, redrawing lines overnight. The crossing at Remagen gave the Allies something they had not expected for weeks: a foothold east of the Rhine before their main offensives even began. Plans were accelerated. The U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges poured more men and armor through the new bridges. Patton's Third Army and Montgomery's 21st Army Group raced to establish their own crossings before the Germans could regroup. The psychological blow to Hitler's command structure was catastrophic. For months, Nazi propaganda had promised the Rhine would hold, that Germany's borders would become an impenetrable wall of defense. But Remagen proved those promises hollow. Hitler raged in the wolf's lair, accusing generals of cowardice and betrayal. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the weary commander of the Western Front, told his staff bluntly, "The war is lost. The Americans are across the Rhine." He wasn't exaggerating. The crossing shattered the illusion of safety within Germany's heartland. Refugees flooded the roads eastward, families with carts, bicycles, and the few possessions they could carry. Civilians in towns along the Rhine watched American artillery flashing from the west and realized the front had already leapt the river. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the Allied air forces intensified their assault. The bridgeheads east of the Rhine became magnets for air cover. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs patrolling constantly, striking any sign of German movement. For the Luftwaffe, already a shadow of its former power, it was the final humiliation. Pilots who once flew proudly over London or Moscow now found themselves powerless to defend their own homeland. On the ground, the success at Remagen created a cascading collapse of German defenses. The bridgehead allowed the 9th Armored Division to link up with the 78th Infantry Division, forming a solid front on the east bank. Within days, American spearheads were pushing deep into the Westerwald forest, threatening the rear of German units still facing the British and Canadians farther north. Remagen had done more than provide a crossing. It had cracked open the entire Western Front. German commanders scrambled to mount counterattacks, throwing together whatever units remained. Teenage Hitler youth, remnants of the 11th Panzer Division, even factory workers handed rifles. They fought with courage but without coordination. Allied artillery and air power annihilated any concentration before it could strike. The Rhine Line, long hailed as Hitler's last shield, was now a corridor of retreat. In Washington and London, news of the crossing brought jubilation. Headlines blazed. Americans crossed the Rhine, Germany's last defense breached. Reporters described the feat as the engineering miracle of the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, already in declining health, sent a message to Eisenhower congratulating the men who had achieved the impossible. But behind the celebration there was quiet awe and exhaustion. Engineers who had worked through the nights at Remagen began to realize what they had survived. Some returned to the West Bank only to collapse in the mud, too tired to speak. Others kept pieces of the bridge's twisted steel as mementos, small fragments of a miracle forged under fire. A sergeant of the 291st Engineer Battalion later said, "We didn't cross just a river. We crossed the last line between war and the end of it." The bridge's destruction on March 17th didn't matter anymore. The Rhine was open, the path into central Germany secure. Eisenhower's armies fanned out in every direction, toward the Ruhr, the Elbe, and ultimately Berlin. And though thousands more would die in the final weeks, the outcome was sealed the moment the first platoon stepped onto that trembling bridge at Remagen. The crossing's shockwave was not just military, it was psychological. It marked the day the German people realized the war had truly come home. In the ruins of Remagen and across the river towns, that realization turned certainty into silence, steel, sacrifice, and the legacy of Remagen. When the dust of the Rhine settled, the story of Remagen did not end with the bridge's collapse. It began there. The engineers who had built, repaired, and ultimately replaced the Ludendorff Bridge had done far more than secure a crossing. They had changed the very rhythm of modern warfare. In the days following the collapse, U.S. Army engineers conducted an exhaustive investigation. They wanted to know why the bridge, despite holding for 10 punishing days, had finally failed. The conclusion was grim but unsurprising. Relentless bombardment, shock from near-miss explosions, and the constant weight of armor had simply torn the structure apart. Yet in its failure lay proof of its triumph. No bridge in the world had ever endured such sustained violence and remained standing for so long. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and 276th Engineer Battalion, who had labored night and day to keep it intact, became legends within the Corps of Engineers. Medals for valor were awarded to dozens. Colonel Clayton Townsend received the Distinguished Service Cross. General William Hoge, the 9th Armored Division commander who had first seized the crossing, was hailed in the press as the man who crossed the Rhine. For those who had fought and built at Remagen, though medals meant little compared to memory, survivors remembered the smell of burned steel, the shriek of rivets flying past their heads, the thunder of artillery echoing through the hills. They remembered the bridge swaying beneath their boots as if alive. Many never forgot the men who fell that day. The engineers lost when the bridge collapsed, and the infantrymen who had fought to hold the far bank against endless German fire. When the war ended, some returned to Remagen as old men, standing at the river's edge where the Ludendorff once stood. The towers on each bank remained, silent sentinels marking the place where courage crossed the Rhine. The crossing's impact on Allied operations was immense. Within 3 weeks of Remagen, U.S. forces had captured the Ruhr industrial heartland, encircling nearly 325,000 German troops. The victory cut off Germany's last sources of coal, steel, and fuel, the lifeblood of its war machine. Military analysts later agreed. The bridge at Remagen shortened the war in Europe by weeks, perhaps months. Every hour gained from the unexpected crossing meant more pressure on Germany's already collapsing armies. It hastened the fall of the Western defenses, opening the road to the Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces would soon meet. The engineering lessons of Remagen echoed far beyond 1945. The speed and improvisation displayed by U.S. combat engineers became a model for modern military engineering. Bridge building under fire became a case study in West Point and military academies around the world. The principle was clear: adaptability wins wars. For the Germans, the bridge's loss became a symbol of futility. The execution of 5 officers for failing to destroy it sent a chill through what remained of the Wehrmacht. Even among German civilians, the tragedy stirred quiet outrage. Many saw in those deaths the collapse not just of command, but of reason itself, a final senseless cruelty in a war already lost. In the years that followed, the ruins of the Ludendorff Bridge became a site of remembrance. The twin stone towers that once anchored the span still rise from each bank, weathered, scarred, and silent. One now houses the Peace Museum at Remagen, where visitors walk through exhibits of helmets, photographs, and fragments of the bridge's iron ribs. On the museum's wall, a single inscription stands out, simple, unadorned: "The bridge that helped end a war." It's a fitting tribute, for at Remagen, victory did not come from overwhelming firepower or from numbers alone. It came from the determination of ordinary men, soldiers and engineers who refused to yield, who turned shattered steel into a path to peace. The story of Remagen was retold in books, documentaries, and a 1969 Hollywood film, The Bridge at Remagen. Yet even in film, the real power of the story remains in its truth, that human resolve, ingenuity, and unity can defy even the laws of war and physics. Today, when the Rhine flows quietly past Remagen, tourists see only a calm river. But beneath that calm lies history. The ghosts of men who built and crossed under fire, and the memory of a bridge that, for 10 unforgettable days, carried the weight of a nation's hope. And from that crossing onward, the Allied armies rolled unbroken into the heart of Germany. As the guns of Europe began to fall silent, and the world inched toward peace, what happened at Remagen would forever stand as proof of what courage and engineering could achieve when the stakes were nothing less than civilization itself. The bridge between war and peace. The Rhine has flowed for centuries, silent, unbending, eternal. But in March 1945, it witnessed something that changed the course of human history. Across its dark waters, men built a path not just of steel and timber, but of resolve, sacrifice, and faith in one another. The story of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen is more than a tale of engineering brilliance. It is the story of humanity's endurance in the face of chaos, of soldiers who refused to stop even as the earth shook beneath their feet. In those 10 days, the line between destruction and creation blurred. While one side sought to tear the bridge down, the other worked to keep it alive. Every rivet, every plank laid under fire, was a testament to a truth that transcends battle, that courage is not only found in charging forward, but in building when the world is falling apart. When the bridge finally collapsed, it did not mark an end. Its fall symbolized completion, the moment its mission was fulfilled. Because by then the Rhine was no longer a barrier. It had been conquered not through arrogance or hatred, but through sheer human will. For Germany, the loss of Remagen signaled the twilight of a war that had consumed a continent. For the Allies, it marked the dawn of victory, and the beginning of the questions that would shape the peace to come. The bridge became a metaphor for transition, from tyranny to freedom, from destruction to rebuilding, from war to the fragile hope of unity. Even decades later, When veterans returned to the quiet banks of Remagen, they did not speak of glory. They spoke of fear, exhaustion, and the strange calm that followed. One American engineer standing beside the crumbling stone towers simply said, "We didn't build it for victory. We built it so no one else would have to die waiting." The Rhine flows still, calm now, indifferent to the echoes of war. Yet the ghosts of that march remain, whispering through the mist, reminding us that even in the darkest hour, bridges can be built between nations, between enemies, and between the past and what must come next. Because at Remagen, they didn't just cross a river, they crossed into history.